was really interesting to hear about your thoughts on how telemedicine services can impact medical services not only in India, but also the medical services in the US and the UK. But I'd like to bring this conversation back to India and actually just speak about the telemedicine guidelines that all of us have been talking about. Just maybe spend a minute or two just explaining or giving a brief overview of that regulations, and maybe we can just continue with the conversation from there. So, in essence, the telemedicine guidelines recognizes three types of telemedicine. That is telemedicine via video media, whereby telemedicine is provided on video platforms such as Zoom, for instance. The second type of telemedicine recognized is audio telemedicine, which is conducted via audio media. And the third type is message telemedicine, which is where telemedicine is conducted through messaging media. This can be WhatsApp or SMS or something to that effect. So I thought of just highlighting 3 to 4 key points that the telemedicine guidelines try to regulate. The first one is who actually can practice telemedicine in India. The telemedicine guidelines prescribe that only a registered medical practitioner can practice telemedicine consultation in India. Now, as I had mentioned, the telemedicine guidelines need to be read with other regulations in order to get a whole picture as to how telemedicine is actually regulated in India. Now, the first point where we'll need to look at another regulation is here. So who is a registered medical practitioner? So the guidelines defines a registered medical practitioner as a person who is enrolled in either a state register or the national register under the Indian Medical Council Act. Now, the second important point that the telemedicine guidelines speak about is actually consent. Now, this is something we've heard a lot about in non-medical services industry and also the medical industry itself, especially with the coming of new data privacy regulations across the globe, from GDPR in Europe to the proposed data protection bill, the personal data protection bill in India. So on consent, the guidelines essentially divide consent into two portions. One, if the patient actually comes to the telemedicine provider, and the second is when the telemedicine provider actually goes to the patient. So what it essentially says is, if I as a patient approach a telemedicine provider and a request for a telemedicine service, in such a case, my consent is implied and no further consent is required. However, on the flip side, if the telemedicine service actually initiates a consultation, then there are two requirements. One, the telemedicine provider must obtain the express written consent of the patient. And the second one is that the telemedicine provider must record such explicit consent. Now, we are assuming this requirement is because in case there is a regulator appointed by the government to regulate telemedicine and the regulator conducts an audit, then these consents must be available as and when the audit occurs. So this is our understanding, although the government's not come up with any specific need for this. The next point is actually prescribing drugs. Now, this is an important part of medicine, as the two of you will know. And to make telemedicine truly effective, we believe that telemedicine providers must be able to prescribe drugs. So the telemedicine guidelines actually allows for this, but makes certain restrictions. Now, in order to understand these restrictions, we will also need to look at the second regulation outside the telemedicine guidelines, that is the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. Now, we need to look at the Drugs and Cosmetics Act because the Drugs and Cosmetics Act basically categorize drugs into various schedules. So you have Schedule A, which is your over-the-counter prescription medicines like paracetamol, all the way up to Schedule X drugs, which are basically highly regulated drugs like, say, morphine. So the guidelines essentially allow practitioners to prescribe only List A drugs to using telemedicine services. Now, we actually believe that this, from a legal standpoint, although it makes sense, and you guys might be able to give the operational implications of this, but we feel that restricting it only to List A drugs or very rudimentary over-the-counter drugs actually restricts the growth of telemedicine. I'll let you guys elaborate that further. And the last important point that the telemedicine guidelines actually prescribe is on intermediary platforms which actually provide telemedicine services. So there are a few obligations, restrictions on these platforms. One, it says that these platforms should conduct a due diligence to ensure that the registered medical practitioner can actually practice medicine. Two, it says that any platform that provides telemedicine services cannot provide telemedicine services if the platform is based solely on artificial intelligence or machine learning. And lastly, it states that the intermediary technology provider must ensure that there is a proper mechanism in place to address any queries or grievances. Now, this is a very rudimentary overview of the telemedicine regulation. And on a legal standpoint, there are a few issues. For instance, we don't exactly know if who the regulator is here. So, will this be regulated under the Indian Medical Council Act, or with certain aspects like consent? Will this be governed by under these guidelines or the IT Act? So there are a few lacunas there, and on a preliminary reviewing from a legal standpoint, it seems that these are just guidelines that the government had a knee-jerk reaction to COVID-19 and came up with, but has not been thought of. And I believe both Dilip and Dhruv spoke about this earlier. So I'd now hand it over to you guys, and just to understand what you guys think of these regulations, and what are your biggest fears, or what is your view on these regulations as a whole?
Yeah, thanks, Shrikant. So, first, I'd like to state by saying that we're glad that there are some regulations that specifically talk to telemedicine in general. I think that itself was a gaping hole when we moved back and started this company 3 years ago, and we were sort of looking to see what the regulatory framework would be to govern the services that we are providing. We had no one place to go or no clear direction. And like you mentioned, there was the IMC Act, there was the IT Act, and a couple of other ones that we had to look at and pick and choose and see which what things among what we're doing comes under what. So we're certainly glad that that the government of India took the step to frame and to devise a regulatory framework for the practice of telemedicine. That having been said, I would like to believe that this is merely, the first step, and probably a temporary guideline till a more well thought out framework, which delves deeper into all the use cases through which telemedicine is practiced, is laid out. Just some of the points that you mentioned, the fact that only a certain type of medications currently are allowed via the use of telemedicine leaves out a huge opportunity to provide healthcare to a large number of patients that don't have access to quality care, that would not be able to get access to quality care using telemedicine in the absence of this prescription ability outside of the currently stated drugs. So that's certainly one point. We wish that it would be more well thought out and take into consideration all the use cases. For example, our use case, where we are a tele-ICU company and we're providing tele-ICU services to hospitals that don't have access to ICU specialist doctors. Right now, in the current framework, we are only able to provide guidance to junior doctors who are there. And if the framework was expanded to include this particular use case, we would be happy to directly take care of patients and take the liability for the care that we provide to patients remotely, which in the current scheme of things does not exist. So there are still these lacunae in the guidelines, and I think the guidelines were needed, especially in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think the government needed to act quickly, and so they were put out. But I think that there is room for improvement in those guidelines. And Dilip, what do you have to say?
Just one thing to add on to that. See, telemedicine needs an underlying framework to succeed. Telemedicine guidelines and laws in isolation do not work. And I'll give an example of that. Today's Indian prescription guidelines on ground as they stand, if you analyze them, they are fairly toothless. So I commend the government on starting the telemedicine guidelines, but we need to look back and see what our pharmacy guidelines and our current medical guidelines look like. most of these medications that you're talking about are already available without prescription. Unscrupulous medical shops are already giving antibiotics and controlled substances without even a proper paper prescription.
Yeah.
So laws as they stand already are not really perfect. So you are not going to claim that you need a perfect telemedicine legal system with consent and everything when the truth of the fact at the ground is already weak and broken. So you will need a completely integrated, accountable pharmacy and a dispensing system to plug into a telemedicine system to make sense. We don't have that. So you go tomorrow, you can get an amoxicillin prescription from a pharmacy without a prescription. You can get that drug today. That is a failure of the existing on-paper system. So when you compare with the US, everybody wants to compare with another system. You have to compare with an infrastructure that exists from the ground up on which a telemedicine system is plugged in. So here you will just have a plug that's hanging in the air. So you can create all the regulations that you want on the prescriber end, but that simply doesn't exist on the pharmacy end. So you're missing the entire loop and claiming that we need the entire telemedicine architecture that's well thought out. It can't function without a foundation. So you need to look at the entire stack. In that context, that's the hack I was talking about. So you can create regulations to make sure doctors do their job right, and that's the right thing to do. However, the easiest thing that is taught in the medical curriculum, and that is a saving grace to 95% of practitioners, is to make your practice patient-centric. So patient centricity is the way to keep patients safe. Now, that is hard to regulate, but if you don't have a regulation, that is the guiding post to go by. Now, I understand that there's a legal problem there because you can't assume that every doctor is patient-centric, and that's fine. The question that we want to answer is what we did, in the 3 years before there were telemedicine guidelines. So we did whatever the 2000 IT Act said and applied the patient-centric mechanisms to it to guide what we should do in our practice, and which is what Dhruv was saying. We liaisoned with the doctor at the bedside, made sure we empowered that doctor and allowed telemedicine to do its thing with a patient-centric approach. That's the hack that we have to use. So to put this in perspective, if the laws don't catch up, still apply those hacks so that they work. This is exactly what is happening in the COVID setting in the US. A lot of their laws have to be tweaked, and because they didn't have time to tweak it, they just let the clinicians, both doctors, nurses, and respiratory therapists, use these basic patient-centric principles to apply care in the COVID pandemic setting. That's what happens. Because regulators at that time are just not going to be able to act fast enough. So if you're going to set up an ICU in Wankhede Stadium, you're not going to be able to meet fire safety and pollution regulations. So what do? You apply the hack that is going to be patient-centric, do what is the right thing and what is right for the patient and the population at large, and the regulations will back you up over time because of your Good Samaritan principles. So we're going to have to do the best we can, given this scenario, till the laws catch up.
I'll come in here, and I think while I appreciate where you're coming from, and that is probably the ideal state of either regulation or less regulation or no regulation altogether. Another prism from which this can be viewed is that the lack of regulation can also lead to the mushrooming of unscrupulous doctors and medical service providers as well. And I think that is a concern that has plagued various industries, including whether it's legal services, all professional services industries have at various points in time looked at persons who are not qualified providing professional advice, the concept of quackery in that sense as well. So I think there is a dilemma there. Applying patient-centric principles is definitely an ideal state, but at the same point in time, having no regulatory framework or a poorly drafted regulatory framework can also leave the government underprotected in the event of cases being brought against either the medical providers or, obviously because of the proliferation of government hospitals in India or the number of government hospitals in India, they themselves are at risk. And the government is one of the biggest litigants across all courts in India today as well. So